myths. There's been plenty of academic study on the psychology of the suspension of disbelief and this ability to enter into poetic faith from a narrative point of view. But what I'm trying to do in this, well, the anthology and then the rest of the series, hopefully, and then also whatever follows on from that, is to extend that into an area, the area of religion and the area of soulful practice. And that just hasn't, as far as I can tell, and I've been looking really hard for quite a long time, it's kind of new stuff. And so I'm almost having to invent a vocabulary for it as I'm writing about it. And then on top of that, trying to introduce the idea to an audience of interested lay people. It's not easy, you know.
Tony Wolff, good to have you back on the podcast.
Hey man, it's good to be back.
Yeah. People who haven't listened to the first one, in that we covered a lot of your background, your origin story, what led you to start investigating this thing that you're calling poetic faith. So people can go back and listen to that because we did dive deep on that back in August 2004, I think it was. And in that time,
2024, I think.
2024, yeah.
Yeah.
And in between, you've, I think, done a retreat based on these ideas. You've released the first edition of what might be an ongoing series of books or turn into a journal of some kind. And so I'm interested in hearing like a little bit more about like what you've been learning as you've been exploring this and getting it out into the world. And also I was hoping that maybe we can get down to some kind of like practical advice for people who are interested in developing their own personal poetic faith. But let's start with just like for people who aren't familiar with the idea, maybe just give an introduction to poetic faith. Like, what does that mean? What are we talking about? What's the need for it? That kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't really developed a précis version of this, so I will be riffing a bit. But the term poetic faith is my own sort of adaptation of a phrase that was coined by the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge back in the 1800s. And he was using it as a sort of rhetorical poetic device. He spoke of the kind of poetic faith that could conjure a suspension of disbelief. So that if you're reading one of his poems or reading a story or something like that, or watching a play, even listening to a piece of music, there is a part of you, part of your psyche, I guess, that is able to really fully enter into the spirit of whatever this narrative is, whatever the medium happens to be, without losing your sense of sort of rationality and naturalism and the way the world actually works. People are able, under these circumstances, to suspend their disbelief and enter into this state of what Coleridge refers to as poetic faith. And about, I don't know, 15 years ago maybe, I was doing an interview, and it occurred to me that by sort of capitalizing the P and the F of that phrase, you could transform it from this sort of literary narrative device into something that would be useful to describe this much sort of broader phenomenon that I'd been sort of active in and paying some attention to, at least since the 1980s. So if you take the capital P of poetic and think of that as poesis, which is the act of artistic creation, and then the capital F of faith, which is usually understood as religious faith, but doesn't need to imply faith in the supernatural. It's just faith in something that means a great deal to you as an individual. Then maybe that would be a sort of a useful phrase, useful sort of catchphrase and framework to describe this phenomenon that otherwise didn't really have a name. And I'd been waiting for decades for some scholar or journalist or someone to notice that in the world there were people who were effectively inventing their own, and I've been using the phrase recently, creative, anti-authoritarian and naturalistic religions. Since then, I've learned the term religion trips a lot of people up because so many people are so conditioned to thinking in terms of sort of authoritarian supernaturalist religions. And as far as scholars are concerned, the word religion is much, much broader than that. And I tend to use it in the scholarly sense. But if the term religion trips people up, you could also think of it as like embodied philosophy or ritualized philosophy. So it's a kind of a philosophy that prioritizes certain things. Imagination is one, a kind of an open-mindedness, as I said earlier, the idea that you don't need to abandon your rational sense of how the world actually works in order to partake in this kind of re-enchanted version of how the world can be. And I guess that's as far as a riff goes, that's a reasonable riff on the idea of poetic faith, I think.
Yeah. And it has something to do with what Keats talked about as the negative capacity as well, which might be a term that people are familiar with as well. Um, it's what you need in order to participate in what Jung called as active imagination. Um, in the book, you give this example from, I think, the late 19th century about a performance of Peter Pan that for me really brought to life what poetic faith in action looks like, it feels like. Are you able to just kind of bring people into that example?
Yeah, it's a profound moment and I ask in the introduction to the book, I sort of offer this as a thought experiment. I ask the reader to imagine themselves as audience members, the first ever stage production of Peter Pan in London during the very late 19th century. And there's a moment in the play in which the protagonist, Peter Pan, is about to drink poison. I think Captain Hook, his arch nemesis, has poisoned his cup. The companion knows about the poison, and all that she can do to save his life is to sort of fly up and drink the poison herself to prevent Peter Pan from drinking it. She's then effectively dying. She's been poisoned. And in this glorious moment of sort of theatrical truth surpassing art, Peter Pan then breaks the fourth wall, addresses the audience directly, and says, "Boys and girls, you must clap your hands. You must clap your hands if you believe in fairies. It's the only way we can save Tinkerbell." I ask the audience to imagine themselves, I ask the reader, imagine themselves as members of that audience, and to ask the question of themselves, do you applaud? And if so, why? And I think that's a really decent way of sort of entering into this idea of what poetic faith is. It feels a bit gauche sort of explaining it after the fact. I kind of like to leave that moment as it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll do that.
Yeah. You leave people with that question. Do
Mm.
you clap to save Tinkerbell and why? The
Yeah,
why is like, that'll keep you thinking for a while.
yeah, hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, if you haven't already, take a moment, like this video and subscribe to the channel. It actually really helps. And look, if you really want to support the podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member. Starting at just $5 a month, you get early release of all episodes weeks before they're out to the public with no ads, no interruptions. We do a monthly call where we get together and we talk about topics like the one we're talking about on this podcast, me and you and other cool people. And you get other stuff. There's a private RSS feed that you can subscribe to and listen to extra bonus content on your favorite podcast player. It's really great and it's growing. So go to patreon.com/howl in the wilderness and join up. Well, one of the things I told you this in our first conversation together, one of the things that I really appreciate about what you've done here in bringing poetic faith and naming this thing, this feeling, this experience, is it's really helped me to understand what I was doing And what I was searching for in terms of like finding practices that connect me with a sense of meaning, of something greater than myself, but does it in a way where I don't have to throw out, yeah, my rational brain, my scientific understanding of the world, what we've learned through all the comparative religious studies and mythological studies, that everything kind of really, in its essence, is an expression of archetypal realities. I really like the way you put it at one point in the book, where it's about not throwing out the what do you say? You don't throw the metaphoric baby out with the metaphysical bathwater. So we can throw out the metaphysics as kind of imaginative speculations about how the world works, but we maintained some of the metaphoric meaning of whatever it is we're doing, the ritual or the devotion to a deity that represents something in the world. I really like that. Don't throw the metaphoric baby out with the metaphysical bathwater. That to me really captures it, what I was seeking.
I'm glad it does, and I'm glad that it's been useful to you. Yeah, the introduction was kind of hard to write because I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but this is very rarefied stuff. This concept has not been kind of widely explored. Certainly not relative to spiritual or ritual paths. There's been plenty of academic study on the psychology of the suspension of disbelief and this ability to enter into poetic faith from a narrative point of view. But what I'm trying to do in this, well, the anthology and then the rest of the series, hopefully, and then also whatever follows on from that, is to extend that into an area, the area of religion and the area of soulful practice. And that just hasn't, as far as I can tell, and I've been looking really hard for quite a long time, it's kind of new stuff. And so I'm almost having to invent a vocabulary for it as I'm writing about it. And then on top of that, trying to introduce the idea to an audience of interested lay people. It's not easy, so I'm glad that came through for you.
Yeah, yeah.
That makes me happy.
Yeah, it's really working. In one of the ways I was trying to bridge the experiences I had in ritual and ceremony with, my kind of like modern materialist rationalist mind. I got into depth psychology. I felt that was like a pretty good bridge, Jung's theory of the archetypes and James Hillman's work on soul, Thomas More's work on, finding or developing a religion of one's own that
Mhm.
is non-literal but still meaningful, and still mysterious. All of that kind of, yeah, it's like a third way. Um, but one of my complaints was always that, like, okay, so they've got the understanding there, but it's a little short on actual practice, kind of like exciting, creative, artistic practice, all the stuff that I got from the ceremonies and rituals that I was in, but I couldn't quite fully immerse myself into because the context of it was asking me to take on the whole belief in the cosmology or whatever, So I found myself still kind of an outsider in those situations, but still getting a lot from it. And I think like what you're doing, what you're working toward is this thing that I've been seeking too, and trying to put these things into practice in a really meaningful and kind of like exciting way as well, because ceremony and ritual should be kind of wild and exciting, I think, for it to be working.
Yeah, I think it has to be. The cliche is mindless ritual. I mentioned this in another interview quite recently. And so I always invite people to imagine what mindful ritual might be. And the concept of mindfulness itself is becoming almost cliche these days. Or certainly it's become commercialized, but it's a useful expression. Mindful ritual. So if we're going to talk about praxis, then I would invite people to, assuming a sort of a Western, predominantly Western oriented audience. Get the rituals that we tend to take for granted in our lives, the symbolic rituals. So they're not necessarily religious, they can be, but it's probably more useful to look at what you might think of as secular ritual. And a really good example is blowing out the candles on a birthday cake and making a wish. And I find that doing that becomes more meaningful every year that I get older. And it's not that I have any supernatural belief that somehow the action of blowing out candles and wishing for something is going to influence the universe to make that thing more likely to happen. To me, it's self-evident that that's not the case. But poetically, symbolically, it's taking a profound moment that happens at roughly the same time every year of my life to make a statement for myself, a silent statement of what I find to be most valuable at that regular interval. And for the part, you know what, I'll respect the tradition and I won't reveal what my wish is. But my experience has been that moment becomes more meaningful for me as I get older. Another useful example, if anyone has ever tossed a coin into a wishing well, made a wish.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as far as I'm concerned, there's no supernaturalist expectation here. It's not that you're going to bend the forces of the cosmos to your will, but you can still take it seriously as a moment of, let's say that your wish is for world peace. All that you're doing in terms of action is tossing a piece of metal into a body of water. But in that moment, you invest the coin with your wish. And this is part of my daily practice as well, not that specifically, but the action of making a sort of ritual sacrifice, sacrificing something to water, to nature. You invest your wish into the coin. You toss it, and of course the flight of the coin is spectacle, and the splash is spectacle. And then if you're into it, you imagine the coin sinking down into the depths, and you're never going to see that coin again. So what's it doing practically? It's, among other things, it's reminding you that money isn't necessarily everything, which is when I was a kid, actually. In practical terms, very frequently, wishing wells these days are actually charitable contributions. Once in a while, a member of a charity will come along and collect all the coins, and so it's doing some actual good in the world. And as a matter of taking seriously this purely, it's an action that could be frivolous, but the more you're able to invest it in something that is in fact emotionally resonant for you and is in fact meaningful, the more in fact meaningful the gesture is. So you take those two examples, blowing out the candles, making a wish, and then extend it out through all of the mostly really small, almost inconsequential rituals that you may find yourself doing when you're just out and about living your life in the world. And I would suggest doing that rather than looking towards institutional religions. I think that institutionalization is a problem in this field. Institutionalization tends to inherently bend towards authoritarianism and exclusion and repression and all of those rather negative things. So I would suggest don't look towards big civic ceremonies that have been arranged by city councils, for example. As far as I'm concerned, I don't get a lot from religious ritual and ceremony either. Yeah, sometimes it's interesting technically, but I don't feel it. It's the small things for me. It's like during the COVID pandemic is a good example. I started going on these long and very ritualistic walks around my Chicago neighborhood. I think I described this when we last spoke. Mm-hmm. And there was a very deeply meaningful moment for me during one of those walks, which I would have described. During those walks, I became aware of all of the little ritual activity that was going on just in this one Chicago neighborhood. I would find, they call them kindness rocks, I think,
Mm.
little smooth pebbles that people would paint with various symbols and that sort of thing. And just place often at the bases of trees. And during the COVID pandemic, that practice just exploded.
Mhm.
You're seeing these things all over the damn place. And it became a sort of a ceremonial practice for people to find a kindness stone and transport it somewhere else in nature and place it down for other people to see. It's this sort of ritual currency in a sense. That invitation for people to actively create art in the world. And the practice, the practical purpose, I think, is that especially under those very fraught circumstances, because among many other things, the COVID lockdowns, it was the initiation of this mass existential crisis. So you impose a mass existential crisis upon what, as far as I am able to perceive, is the single most death-phobic society that's ever existed in the history of humanity, which is present-day technologically advanced Western society. And watch what happens. And one of the things that happens is people start taking this quaint little practice of painting stones really quite seriously.
Mhm.
And I could go on, but during those walks, I began to notice more and more of this sort of artistic, poetic, I would say quite deeply meaningful, largely improvisational activity happening in the world. Sometimes I'd see it in person, more often I'd come across the evidence of it. I'd come across a candle that had burned down in a particular spot, and I'd have no idea what the significance was. But clearly this was a thing that had been of significance to a person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm moving too far away from the question now, but that I think would be some good basic advice, is to pay attention to what you have perhaps always done in that regard. Think about what it means at a slightly deeper level, and then in a sense give yourself permission to take that really fucking seriously.
Yeah. Mhm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I would say like how finding the meaning on like the level of the soul, which we could say is like perhaps irrational. I don't have to explain why it's meaningful. It just is. And like you said, honoring that, valuing that. It's what's also interesting is like the rock thing. That also is going on up way up here in the Pacific Northwest on our island. I go, I run and walk the same path at least once or twice a day, and that was a practice that was happening up here too. And it's something that ripples out into the world, and people are picking up and doing in different places. Uh, yeah, I'm thinking about the beginning of the lockdown, the pandemic. We happened to be living in Montreal at the time, a dense urban place, much different from where we live now. But one of the things that was really beautiful was this ritual that people had, right before dinner time. People would go out on the little terraces that we have in Montreal, and they would start banging pots together and making all kinds of noise. It was like, even though we're apart right now, I want you to know that I'm here.
Yeah, the same thing happened here. And also during the pandemic, you can see my stained glass behind us here. We think it's a representation of the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu.
Hmm.
We sort of inherited that from an artist who had deceased, so we're not sure. But during the pandemic lockdowns, we actually arranged lamps inside our home and deliberately illuminated the stained glass so that people walking past, at that time we lived adjacent to an alley in Chicago, so that anyone who happened to walk or drive past would just get this, as it happens, mythic, but in any case, this sort of bright spot of color and life and art in the midst of what was really a pretty grim and threatening time.
Hmm.
Because why not? Because it just requires a little bit of imagination, a little bit of work, and maybe it helps to brighten someone's day just a bit. And under those circumstances, morale is really important.
Yeah.
So important.
Hmm. Yeah. I like the way you're putting the focus on. I've been using this term for years as I've kind of been developing my own thing over here and trying to figure out, well, how do I communicate this to other people? And it's what I call little rituals. Like you're saying, all those like little everyday things that can be quite personal, meaningful only to you. But I like that, just little rituals. So it's not some big grandiose performance. You know, you don't have to get everyone together and get the cloaks out of the dry cleaning and, you know, do this big thing. But it's those little rituals that, when done over time, and with that sense of, you know, serious but not literal, something like that, with some poetic faith.
Serious play or deep play is a
Yeah,
useful line here. Yeah.
yeah. um, that all adds up to something. And one of the things that your work has helped me do is to reflect on all those little rituals that have come to me. It's not something that I set out to develop, but I found that, oh my God, like all these little things from the time I wake up until the time I go to bed, my day is filled with all these little rituals. You know, part of my morning routine is doing certain things and, you know, singing these little songs that come to me. You know, there's a spot where I run with my dog in the morning, same spot every morning. Sun is just coming up over the trees on one side, and then the other side is the ocean. So I'll often sing a little song to the ocean, do my little chant to the sun, do this little ritual. And no one is around, no one is witnessing this. I don't really talk about it to anybody, but it's meaningful, and there's something about the way you've framed it, the way you've talked about this, that helps me to like recognize the significance of all those little actions, and that they are forming something of my own creative religion.
Yeah. And then if people want to get more elaborate with it, allowing that this is an extraordinarily niche concept, really, um, then I think you can, like, let me go back a bit. I first started doing this sort of thing consciously in the late 1980s, early 90s. We talked about that last time, I think, my story of the three moments. But I can highlight this rather romantic period when I was just kind of getting into this idea, when I felt first gave myself permission to really embrace this concept, which I did very wholeheartedly. And I was sort of drunk with the potentials of it, and with experimenting, with the idea of experimenting with what this thing could be. And I gave myself permission to do some really pretty extreme stuff, looking back. Self-devised vision quests. I was living in Wellington, New Zealand at that time. Um, and Wellington is a coastal city, so the bays and rocks and mountains and all sorts of things. It's really easy to get into wilderness if you're living in Wellington. And I would do these self-devised vision quests. I would go out like in the late afternoon along Red Rocks, for example, Red Rocks Trail, which is this very wild stretch of coastline that just sort of stretches out away from the city. And there's a wild seal colony, as opposed to a tame seal colony. There is a seal colony out at the end, at one of the ends of Red Rocks Beach. And I would challenge myself as doing that sort of excursion to, for me, it was often physical. It was often a matter of physical risk. But I would climb cliffs, free climb cliffs, and construct hidden altars. And only I would ever know that they were there. And for all I know, some of the little stones and things that I put in these crevices up these cliffs, maybe they're still there, whatever it is now, 30 years later, 35 years. I hope they are. I was very into Norse mythology at that time, Norse and Celtic. And I had constructed a Thrudhamar, which is in Old Norse is it's the hammer of strength inspired by Thor's hammer. And I would take that item up onto the top of the mountain and do this sort of ritual calisthenics, swinging this sledgehammer around, effectively in honor of the deity Thor, without believing in Thor as a deity, but I was so drunk with the symbolism and the romance and the drama, the excitement of this thing that I was allowing myself to experience. Yeah, there were lots of things like that. So what I do now at the age of 57 or something is far tamer than that. You know, a lot of what I do, a lot of what I was doing then, it would be foolish for me to physically attempt now. But I do think it was maybe useful for me at that stage to throw myself into it with that kind of young man's daring and enthusiasm, because it established a precedent that as I've gotten older, I can retain something of the spirit of those experiments, of those exercises and those creations at a quieter level, I guess, at a level that befits an older man moving through the world. But I haven't lost the ability to take that type of exercise, that type of ritual, that type of metaphorical practice, artistic practice seriously. And in fact, after doing it for so long, these days I just take that for granted. I don't need to think about that. And I do think it's valuable. I really think it's valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking about like what makes something meaningful, what makes something significant. And one of the things that came to me was the idea of like sincere repetition. Like maybe it's like the idea of faking it until you make it. You know, if you have trouble kind of giving yourself over to this poetic faith view or mode, but you find something that feels somewhat meaningful and you just continue to do it. And I find that the meaning develops over time, the significance develops over time, and maybe even reveals something like quite unexpected in terms of like why it's meaningful or what it means or what it's relating to.
Yes, I find it absolutely does. I referred earlier to part of my daily ritual, which is part of an expedition. It takes about 45 minutes walking the banks of the local river. And part of that does involve selecting a pebble and carrying it with me, and then later, as I'm crossing a bridge, throwing that pebble out into the middle of the river. And I describe that, I think, the section of the book that's about my own practice called the Mysterium. I think I describe it in there. And readers who are reading this in a book, there'll be an image, you know, a guy throwing a stone into a river and the concentric circles of ripples flowing out. But when it's the physical doing, and as you say, it's particularly the doing every day, that makes the difference, because then you notice things. You have time to notice things. Like, for example, sometimes the river is running really hard and rough. And under those circumstances, I can throw my stone, which under these sort of mythopoetic circumstance represents my life. And when it hits that rough water, it barely even makes a splash. You have to look really, really hard to find the ripples. And they vanish quickly, they dissipate. And that's kind of a life lesson, because if the stream is the world, is life, and this little stone represents my contribution to it, then under certain circumstances, you better throw the stone really hard if you want to make any sort of impact. And then on other days, it's barely moving. It's like a pond, and you can just toss your stone in, and there's this beautiful sort of shimmering, glimmering series of ripples that go out to the banks and then sort of bounce off the banks and back in. And that teaches something as well.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you know, I would always recommend people do this sort of thing in nature rather than what's the business of writing post-it notes and those sorts of things. There's a sort of a corporate living room version of ritual. It's not that you can't do things in your living room. There's value to that, but I think you deliberately put yourself in. You deliberately remove yourself from your entirely comfortable environment. And I don't necessarily feel every morning, early every morning, like going out on this 45-minute expedition, but I do it anyway. And I think that adds this kind of resonance to the activity as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I don't feel like like setting out on this journey, which even at my age does in fact involve a little bit of physical risk these days. I always am happy upon my return that I've done it. You do the thing in nature, and then that gives you a way of noticing your place in nature.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily obvious if you spend your entire life, in your home or traveling from office to home to office. The nature becomes your third space, and then you start to incorporate, or I start to incorporate that into my ritual practice. So at the time that the leaves start to fall, I have a practice of gathering fallen leaves, which I use in memorial rituals. After summer storms, particularly, I have a practice of picking up fallen flower heads and flower petals. And I have a particular place in my shrine, and I keep those and they dry out. And when it comes time for me to perform a particular kind of memorial ritual, then I make use of those petals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, really simple stuff that just occurs to you kind of as you're doing the thing. And because you've given yourself this permission to enter this state of deep play, and it's a constant process of experimentation, something will just occur to you and you'll say, aha. You pick up an acorn, or you sing a song, or you lean against a tree, or whatever it might be. And then you find, oh, okay, I got something out of that. And then over time, you might refine it or change it or elaborate it or simplify it or whatever. And then over time, it just becomes part of this thing that you do.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably a next step that we're moving towards, which would be maybe the next step after the little rituals, which you might, I would think of as finding your touchstones.
Mm-hmm.
I write a bit about, or I was interviewed. It's recorded in the book of it. Once you're able to take the idea seriously, intellectually, you've sort of got a handle on what poetic faith is. You can experiment by doing little rituals in the world. If you find that you're getting something out of it, then that's a great time to start looking for touchstones. And for me, that was part of this very intense period in my early 20s when I was just balls to the wall with stuff. And even at that age, I was able to look back through my life and figure out what the most important things were. And some of them were very obvious, like my son. I had an infant son. That's important to me. But others were things, sort of more subtle things, themes that I'd found recurring in my life to that point. Moments when I'd had this sort of visceral, yes, that reaction, even if I didn't necessarily know consciously why.
Mm-hmm.
And that could happen in all sorts of media. That was certain movies, certain scenes in like a TV show, a poem that you might happen to come across in some old book of poems. Maybe a whole song, maybe just a line from a song. And over time, by identifying the touchstones and again taking that as seriously as part of the practice, I was able to kind of emerge with a grand theme.
Mm-hmm.
And the grand theme for me was this kind of positive existentialist approach to life, which I much, much later sort of nicknamed the Mysterium. Once you've got your touchstones down, then you're starting to kind of cook with gas, because at this point you're developing a praxis, you're developing this series of motifs and songs and artworks and all manner of things. Items of clothing, items of jewelry. I'm wearing one right now. And at that point, maybe then you take it to the next step beyond, which is that you start to develop kind of the grand narrative, and you start to name it. And at that point, there's not much, I think, you're entering religion territory at that point.
Yeah.
Or at least embodied territory. Once you've named it, once you've said these are the most important things, this is the symbol, or these are the symbols that tie all of this together. These are now my ritual practices, and some of them are very small and daily things, and some of them reflect moments in my life that only come along once in a while, And some of them are regular, every year on this day at this time, I'm going to be doing this activity. Yeah, I think that's religion. I think that, well, certainly it's poetic faith.
Hmm. Yeah. And then just get on with it at
Yeah.
that point, and and allow it to evolve too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Just going back, I think like doing little rituals in nature is important for a lot of reasons. Like one, we just need more nature immersion, more connection with nature in this day and age. But also like what, one of the elements that makes a ritual space uh, powerful is that element of the unexpected. We're outside of the norm, you know. We've taken that hero's journey from the known into the unknown. And like the living room or the office is a very predictable kind of space. It's closed off from the elemental world to a large degree. But you go out in nature and it's always changing. And there's always like something unexpected, whether that's a creature that shows up, a crow that starts squawking at you at just the right moment, or the bunny that hops across the path, whatever it may be. And so that's like, I think, even like anthropologists would say that that's like an essential element of a good or functional transformational ritual space, is that element of the unknown, the unpredictable, um,
Yeah.
the mystery of the mysterium.
Yes. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah. I mean, last year I had that experience dramatically. There was it was a red-winged blackbird that had set up its nest right above part of my pathway. And I wasn't familiar with red-winged blackbirds. In New Zealand, we have magpies and similar territorial birds. But this particular bird really didn't like me at all. And I couldn't figure out why. I made a bit of a study of it over a couple of months, possibly because it didn't like the sun reflecting off the long white hair or something. But this bird would go for me and more or less ignore some other people, but it always went for me. And it got to be kind of annoying because you're walking along and you get a little paranoid because you're from behind. The first time it happened, it came down and skipped the top of my. I wear a cap because I'm balding on top. So when I go outside, I wear a cap, and it skipped the top of my cap. Whoa, what the hell? Was not expecting that. Figured it was a one-off, but the exact same thing happened the next day and the day after that, and this bird just did not like me. So that became this. I eventually figured out that the way to stop the bird from attacking me, because obviously I don't want to start swinging at it, I don't want to hurt the bird. The bird's just defending its nest as far as it's concerned. But likewise, I don't want to be attacked all the time. I figured out at a certain point, and I got to know exactly where this bird was. Every morning it was in the same spot in the same tree. And so we'd sort of eye each other. I'd walk along and the bird would fly down to another tree across the path. And at that point, it's gearing up for its attack. And then I would hear the towards me and I would spin around, spin on my heel. And as soon as it saw my predator eyes, it would veer away every single time because that's what its instinct is. You don't attack the predator if the predator is looking at you. And I ritualized that, and it became kind of a game. So it was the same routine every day: walk along, down, up behind. I turn, I stare at it, and then as it veers away, because it always veered away in the same direction, I did the sort of "begone" gesture like that, just for fun, just for fun.
Yeah.
And for, I think, the entertainment occasionally of other early morning walkers who happen to see this thing happen, and to whom I probably look like some sort of shum.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. It's the unexpected stuff. There was much more of that when I was a lot younger, when I was really sort of pushing the boundaries of physical safety in this. There were encounters with wildlife, and there were encounters with wild people too. That still sometimes happens, but these days it's in a more sort of more of a tame neighborhood level.
Hmm.
But I certainly agree that being out in nature opens you to the possibilities of the unexpected in ways that are profoundly useful if you want to approach the mystery.
Mm. Yeah. And it keeps things from becoming too stale, right? Keeps like it's always fresh and new.
If the right becomes rote, you change the right. That's one of my watchwords.
Nice one.
Yeah,
If the
and
right become, if, wait, let me just
if
get that. If the right becomes rote, you change the right.
yes, yeah,
RITE. Yeah.
RITE. Yeah, and that I take that again. It's really seriously. So sometimes, if I feel like my regular path is getting dull for whatever reason, I'll simply change it up. I'll walk somewhere new. There was a tradition you're probably familiar with, the Situationists, I think, French school of philosophy, sort of mid-20th century.
Guy
And they
Debord.
developed the practice of the dérive, which is this idea that you walk the streets of Paris with the aim of getting lost and discovering something new. So they were sort of philosophical art school. But to me, that has significant soulful potential as well. So although my daily ritual is fairly routine, if I feel that it's becoming rote, then I will completely change it, or I'll do it backwards.
Hmm.
In some instances, literally.
I like that.
Because
Just put a pin
yeah,
in that. The like
sure,
I see that as like the city streets as labyrinth.
yes,
Yeah, it's great.
yeah, yeah,
Working with
um,
what's there.
yes, yeah, and paying sufficient attention to what's there, and also being willing to change what's there a little bit if
Mm.
that's useful for you. Like I was talking before about well, during the pandemic. I think this must have been just after the pandemic happened. I can't actually recall right now, but we were living in Rogers Park, which is a rather artsy sort of university district neighborhood of Chicago, right adjacent to the lake. And they had this thing there called the art wall, which I think they still do, which is a really long concrete seawall sort of thing, which is actually shaped like a bench. But it's there so that if the lake rises, then the adjacent park is less likely to be just flooded. So hundreds of feet long, and it's this sort of bench-shaped wall structure. When it was first installed, I don't know, decades ago, they were having a real problem with local gangs graffitiing the wall.
Yeah.
And so the local, I can't remember the council, whatever it was, set up a new tradition, which was painting the wall. And any resident of the neighborhood could pay some token amount, $5 or something, and they would get a like 4 foot long section of the wall that on a particular day of the year they could decorate, they could paint whoever they wanted to.
Hmm.
And which is a fun thing. And I always enjoyed on my walks, looking at people's various art. And the art would be there for a year, and then the entire wall would be whitewashed. And a couple of days later, a whole new set of artists would set to creating their art. One year, I had this inspiration, and I paid my $5 and got some paint, and painted my section of the wall sort of midnight blue. And then on the wall, the only decoration apart from this midnight blue was a section or a paraphrase actually from a poem. I wonder if I can quote it now. Yeah. With hope that this assemblage of rubble might become a shrine.
Mm.
And that was it. So that was painted sort of a calligraphic style on the wall. And then on top, because it's shaped sort of like a bench, on top, I left a scattering of objects, old bricks that have been tumbled around Lake Michigan for probably for decades, and some little shells and pieces of driftwood. And I just left them on there, and that became my project. So for the next year, I became the curator of whatever this thing might turn into.
Hmm.
And I would visit it typically twice a day, once early morning and then sort of early evening. And boy, did that become a thing.
Mm.
Yeah. And there was vandalism, which I repaired. And at other times, people placed all manner of things on that ad hoc community shrine. It was in a very public spot, very popular spot. This was the beach walk, the beach itself, and the park were very highly trafficked, especially during the summer months. And people would leave candles there and incense and little. There was a collection of old like Christmas tree ornaments that sort of transformed the shrine into the island of misfit toys for a while.
Mm.
And people would create little artworks, little dioramas, and leave them there. And sometimes particular religious items as well. Is it the Hamsa, the Buddhist hand symbol?
Sure. Yeah.
And votive candles. And I very, very seldom knew the significance of the items, the tokens, the offerings, I guess, that people left on the shrine.
The votives. Yeah.
Yeah. I very seldom knew what they were. I would just come across them after the fact and kind of tend to them for as long as they lasted. And it became a real thing. It was a feature of the community, and it appeared in the local newspaper and all sorts of things. And that experience really taught me the potential value of that type of enactment of poetic faith. Like, I know for a fact that I remember one instance, because I would sort of hang back. I didn't want to necessarily publicly identify myself as the artist who created the shrine. I didn't see value in that. But I would often kind of hang back and just watch how people interacted with it. And I remember one young lady walking along, and she looked at it, looked away, did a double take, looked back, and reflectively crossed herself. And I think that there was a religious part of her that recognized that this was a shrine of some sort. And so she figured, well, I'll be on the safe side.
Safe side meaning she did her gesture of protection, maybe from this pagan shrine.
That did occur to me, and I'm pretty sure that was the motivation behind some of the vandalism too.
Yeah.
I don't know, but for a period of about a month, there was a regular vandal who would show up early in the morning, and at that time the shrine was largely comprised of these old bricks. I really liked the aesthetic of these old lake bricks that I'd find on the seashore. They'd just been washed and tumbled around in the lake. And you'd create these sort of almost Stonehenge-like structures. So I might do that one day, and the next day I'd come along and someone else had rearranged them in a different pattern, which was always cool. For about a month, I'd show up and the bricks had just been smashed. You could see someone had just grabbed them and smashed them. And it wasn't just once, this was like daily. And I thought, okay, game on. And eventually I had to start bringing bricks from an adjacent beach because I was running out of bricks. And so I would stuff these bricks into my pockets and sort of into my satchel and tote them a significant distance and then hide them in shrubbery sort of 50 feet away from the shrine so that I would be able to replace the vandalism damage each time. And I outlasted that person. Whoever the mystery vandal was, I outlasted them, and the shrine continued.
Oh man. It reminds me, during the COVID time, as I call it, one of my neighbors on our walking path alongside the ocean would always make like stack the stones. You know that practice. They would stack up some stones, and I made it my practice to go along and knock them down. I was thinking of myself as an agent of chaos. And my wife would always give me shit. She's like,
Yep.
Terry is like, he loves doing that. And I said, I know, but I'm giving him reason to do it again tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. And there you're getting into this really interesting kind of psychological and aesthetic and sentimental territory.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a big controversy about that. There are beaches in New Zealand where the local custom is that people build really quite elaborate sculptures out of driftwood.
Hmm.
And I think to some extent, there's just not much else to do at a beach. There's a lot of driftwood lying around and you can go for a swim or you can make something.
Yeah.
And it's controversial because some locals really don't like that. This is some sort of a psychological sticking point for people.
Yeah.
I used to teach a course for morbid anatomy, which was all about memorial and memento mori ritual, especially sort of innovations in that sphere. And some people love the practice; they love doing it. They love seeing the sculptures, whatever the ritual construct is. And other people have this almost visceral reaction of like disgust when they see it. And I am of the build build the structure mentality myself, but I understand from the agent of chaos point of view that yes, you are in fact giving that person a reason to continue with their practice.
Hmm.
I build occasionally I build rock stone stacks as a memorial for a particular individual in my life who died many years ago. And I've occasionally brought it up in conversation online and in person. And I think there's an elaboration or maybe an exaggeration of the leave no trace mentality
Mm. Yeah.
that says you must not do that under any circumstances because you're sort of imposing your will, your aesthetic upon the scene. And I could argue that either way, because I know that from my point of view, what I'm doing is honoring the life of one of my best friends who died in a way that is very meaningful. And I know that in practice, within a certain amount of time, the little river will rise, or the rain will fall, or the wind will blow, and the stones will become scattered again. It's not that I'm in fact doing anything to damage the environment. But yeah, some people have this just absolute visceral reaction against that type of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Same thing goes on here. We have the driftwood sculptures, and someone will put a lot of time and effort into crafting something, and then there's a bunch of people who come along and they complain because they've disturbed the natural ecosystem or something. And yeah, it's an endless kind of tug of war. And I feel it's like it's almost like that old, the Christian and the pagan. I'm thinking about how a lot of the shrines were defaced, the heads knocked off the old deities, and all of that stuff. I mean, it's still going on in these little ways. Um, I just want to kind of touch on this a little bit more. What I find so interesting about the that shrine that you started on at the seawall or the lake wall. Um, okay, one of the ways I was thinking about poetic faith and the different poetic faiths that you describe or you interview people about in the book, including your own, is that it's a real bricoleur approach, right? And that's kind of like what I've cobbled together something from all these different elements, a song or a chant from this tradition or something that's, that just come to me spontaneously or whatever. And it's putting together in this bricoleur fashion. And what your seawall or lake wall experiment project was like a real kind of symbolic analogy or metaphoric uh, uh, enactment of that in a way, allowing people to take these different elements or bring something new and piece something together that becomes a shrine. And this piece of poetry that you chose about oh, how did it go? I've lost the this assembling a shrine from the rubble.
With hope that this assemblage of rubble might become a shrine.
Yeah. I mean, that to me sounds like something that Stephen Jenkinson, who you interviewed for the first edition, that sounds like the kind of cryptic instruction or blessing or prayer that he might give. It's got that same kind of feel to it, like thinking about us as kind of displaced European people, in North America or in New Zealand, where a lot of our familial traditions were left behind, and then we're left struggling with finding meaning in this postmodernist world, and what can we do but look around and look at the rubble and see what we can kind of cobble together from that. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. There is, I appreciate the sentiment. Bricolage, yes. I think that in order for me to be interested in one of these practices as a poetic faith, there has to be I don't know if it's a layer on top of that or something that's deeper than that, but I'm not that interested in practices that are purely eclectic. If someone's practice, it's not, I don't mean to denigrate that, but if someone's practice is they do yoga and they read tarot and they
Wait, are you describing me? I mean, is this feels a little passive aggressive? I mean, I practice
I
yoga. I've got a tarot deck here. Go on, go on.
no,
I'm not taking
okay, but
offense.
okay, well, I will try. Um, so that and that, and they do mindfulness meditation, and they
Drink ayahuasca.
sure drink ayahuasca. So they have a collection of practices. For me, and I think that that's entirely valid. What really excites me is the people who either take it to this next level or who sort of approach it from this deeper level. And I haven't really thought about this previous to this conversation, but who have made it something that is more intimately their own, as I did with the Mysterium by naming it, by selecting the symbols, and it's a matter of I think that evolves naturally out of the touchstone idea.
Hmm.
If you and this may just be like the way I sort of perceive the world, but I was able really quite quickly to look back through my life in my early 20s and say this is the big theme, and that has in fact been true for me ever since then. So I'm comfortable saying this is the big theme of my life, and from that sort of perception I can select symbols and I can say, these particular books and these particular songs and these particular rituals. So it's not a kind of generalized eclecticism.
Hmm.
And the practices that I have adopted or really adapted from extant customs, they're never adapted wholesale. Like I don't read tarot, but I did go to considerable time and some expense in creating a set of what I call contemplation cards, um, which were inspired by the poetry of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Are you familiar with that at all?
I know the name. I haven't read it.
Yeah. Um, Compilation of poetic aphorisms put together by a probably anonymous poet, but the way his name is passed down in history, he was called Omar Khayyam. Very obscure, certainly in the Western world, until an Englishman who was able to do at least a rough translation did that translation during, I think, the 1850s, 1860s. And so for the first time, effectively, the poetry of Omar Khayyam, this collection of short poems, became available to the English-speaking world. And it created a sensation, not immediately, but it was picked up by members of the Romantic poetry movement who said, oh, have you seen this poem? Oh my God. Because it was representing this radically different philosophy of life and death to anything that anyone in Europe had experienced for certainly throughout much of the long Christian era. The poetry of Omar Khayyam is this radically sort of proto-existentialist philosophy that is deeply skeptical about the idea of the supernatural, extremely skeptical about the idea of any literal afterlife, and so represents it's the sort of Epicurean that if you go back far enough into European history, by the time you get back to the Epicureans, they had a similar sentiment. And then the sentiment basically just vanished, was submerged by Christianity all the way, almost literally all the way up until the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was published in English. And it created the sensation, and people were holding, Omar Khayyam parties and Omar Khayyam picnics. And it became commercialized, and people were doing Omar Khayyam jewelry and and perfumes and all kinds of things. It was a massive international cultural craze around the turn of the 20th century. And I came across a really beautiful set of illustrations, sort of mystical illustrations of each one of the poems. I can't recall right now how many there were. This was a few years ago. And it occurred to me that you could create a almost tarot-like deck of these cards, and each one would represent one of these illustrations, and then would have the text of the poem underneath it. And so it could be used like a tarot card deck, not so much for foretelling the future, which is not something I believe in at a literal level, but could be used as a way of the way I think divination works, which is basically applying a series of objective symbols randomly to a subjective situation in order to gain insight.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent months, it was a long process tracking these things, tracking the images down and making sure the translations were correct and doing various artistic embellishments and so on. And then the whole technical process of turning them into a deck of contemplation cards. But I did all of that, and it is exquisitely kind of in tune with the grand theme of the Mysterium, because the entire poetic philosophy of Omar Khayyam is like a distillation of my very deepest concepts of what is most important in life and what is most important about death. So that's a very long-winded example, but so for me, as someone who promotes poetic faith, it wouldn't be enough just to find a nice tarot deck. I have to create my own. It wouldn't be enough for me to create, say, an ofrenda in the style of the Dia de Muertos. I have to figure out for myself what is most meaningful to me about this tradition that I respect, but I'm not part of. And then how, as an artist, I guess, how can I work with that in a way that is intrinsic to the way I see things? How can I make that part of the Mysterium and not just this other practice that is grafted into this thing that I do?
Yeah. No, I get it. It's a subtle distinction, I think, is what you're trying to talk about here. But it's but something like there being some connective tissue between these practices or these images, these ideas, and the connective tissue. I mean, one of the ways that soul is described is that kind of in-between essence, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's like the kind of what is the soul of the practice, and that is deeply personal, you know.
It is. I mean, I don't have a way to teach the Mysterium. This came up in another interview quite recently, and I think I talk about it in the book as well. I've never come up with a way to teach it. I've never had a circumstance really to teach it. I guess we can talk a bit about the event we did, the retreat at Sky Meadow, which was literally the first time I'd ever tried to teach this stuff. Okay, let's jump into that, because it's very illustrative, I think, of what you're talking about in terms of soulful connective tissue. So when last we met, that was, I think, several months out from running this retreat at Sky Meadow, which is Brendan Dempsey's glorious spiritual nature retreat up in the northeastern mountains of Vermont. And I'd been to Sky Meadow a number of times during that year last year. It had struck me as with the force of a thunderbolt, the sudden inspiration, we should try to do a mystery school at Sky Meadow. And with only about a month to put this whole thing together logistically and in terms of promoting it and structuring it and so on. So it was a frenzy of activity at that time. But it was also about the first time that I ever had to think about how would I teach this stuff? Because there are going to be people who are physically there and wanting to learn something from me. I don't really think of myself as a teacher. I've been doing this weird little thing by myself for 35 years. So I asked myself, is this something that's potentially of value to other people? Yeah, I think it is. So, okay, so how do I teach it? And part of the prep was that I would send out these emails to all of the participants that included links, because I like to use the technology. It included links to like this particular scene from this obscure indie movie. So you watch that scene. And I think I just used one of the poems of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, this particular poem. This scene from this other indie movie, this song, a suggestion, read this novel if you have time, which was the novel Messiah by Gore Vidal, 1954.
Which I just
And
read based on your recommendation, and we'll talk about that because it's a cautionary
yes,
tale. Yeah.
yes, please, yeah.
Mhm.
And so during the month, or starting about a month before we all showed up at Sky Meadow with the expectation of doing something, I sent them like all of the stuff that I had pulled together over 35 years. Not literally all of it, because that would have overwhelmed people, but a great deal of sort of the selected essence of all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With no particular suggestion as to how they should read or experience or listen to,
Or how one relates to the other.
yeah,
Yeah.
but with the sort of intuitive understanding, or at least hope, that if they took that task seriously, and I know a number of them did, and they actually followed through and they read the poem and they saw the show and they listened to the song under these circumstances and so on, that they would at least arrive at Sky Meadow, way up in the northeastern Vermont mountains, with a sense of what it was we were there to do. And so that in a sense, all of that prep was leading up to this one moment during our opening ritual, which I can describe, I think, under these circumstances. It took place in a room that they call the hearth these days, which is bare earth floor, a series of benches arranged in a circle, and it's a perfectly round room, open to the sky with a big fire pit in the middle. And I had set up a duende shrine in the space the day before. The duende shrine, I think I may have described it during our last conversation, but it's inspired by the vanitas aesthetic of like 1700s Dutch still life art. And the theme of a duende as art, as assemblage art, as painting, is impermanence and transience. So the central motif is often a skull wearing a floral wreath, which is also the duende. That's the central symbol of the mysterium. And there's a collection of objects. There's an hourglass, there's a candle holder with a candle stub burned almost all the way down, a scattering of dead leaves, old coins, old items of jewelry, very old books, things that were once valuable but are now decaying, rusting. So that's the vibe, that's the scene. And so people arrive in the space and there's a fire going and there's incense and there's candles on the shrine. And each person in turn, after I'd introduced what we were there to do using suitably mythopoetic language, each person was invited to contribute to the shrine an item which they'd selected during the preparatory period. The item represented why they were there, why they had taken the risk and gone to the effort and the expense and all of the rest of it, of leaving their daily lives behind, traveling way up into the mountains to find themselves in this absolutely bizarre situation with this weird guy from another country, and there's a shrine with a skull on it and candles and fire. This item represents why you are here now. And so each one of them told the story of the item, the story that had brought them to this place at this time. And then they placed their item on the shrine and joined all of the other objects there. And then once we'd all told our stories, that effectively ended the opening night ritual. It's the space in between. It's as you were saying. I don't think there's ever going to be a Bible of the Mysterium, which is my own practice. As a matter of design, if I wanted to, I could probably sit down and write something like that. I don't want to because I have such respect for the idea of deep play, for the idea that the real value of this stuff is found in the connections that people make when they come across this particular song, or when this artwork is recommended to them, or when they take the chance to go out into the world and do this crazy thing that maybe they would never have considered doing, but maybe under certain circumstances they feel a sense of permission, or they even feel a sense of encouragement. They say, you know what, this is crazy. I'm going to do it and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then in between all of that, in between reading Messiah and listening to this song, and in between all of that, that I think is where the Mysterium is. That's certainly where it is for me. And I guess I get to say that's where it is for other people because I invented the fucking thing.
Or leaving it open to be whatever it is to them. Let it be like when you create an artwork, you have no control over how people are going to interpret it, how they're going to see it, how they're going to react
Yeah,
to it. That's part of the beauty of it, right? It's
that's
like
exactly what I
I
mean.
know
Yeah,
why I created it, what it means to me, but that's actually the least relevant thing to anybody else. You know, it's what does this evoke or provoke in someone else? That to me is like good reason for getting it out there.
yeah, and that's exactly what I mean. It's
Yeah.
and you could reduce something like that to a Bible, to
Yes,
a
totally.
sacred tongue, but I don't want to.
Yeah.
I want the constituent items to be scattered. I want, among other things, I want there to be an element of challenge in the thing.
Hmm.
Like doing this event at Sky Meadow. Sky Meadow is a ways out. The nearest big town is Burlington, Vermont, and that's not really a big town.
Yeah.
And that's like an hour and a half drive. From Boston, it's a solid, 3 hour drive just to get there.
Yeah.
So you've
Yeah.
got to want it. You've got to really want to be there. And for the people who make the trip, it's magical.
Hmm. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
would not leave this place. But 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 doing all of that, I think making that effort and taking that risk, that's a massive part of what makes the experience, whatever happens there, into this enchanted, deeply poetic faith experience.
Totally. Yeah. And you ask any anthropologist and they're, what makes a good ritual? What makes a ritual that works? So not only what we talked about before, like the element of the unknown, of the mystery, but like you've just said, risk, sacrifice, something of the ordeal, right? And that kind of journey that you're talking about puts you into an altered state of consciousness. Getting off the plane, getting in a car, driving up through some windy road, these green mountains, with the different kind of trees, and your consciousness is changing, as you get to the place, as you travel to the place, so that when you arrive, you're maybe more open, more receptive, more attuned.
Yeah, it heightens you. And as you were saying that, I was flashing back to literally to the journey that we took to get to Sky Meadow. And it was this last time as we were traveling there for the mystery school. We arrived a day before the participants did, so that we were able to set certain things up and kind of get a feel for what the experience would be for them. But on the way there, it was a very misty night, misty to the point that we had to slow the car significantly because there's no streetlights up there. It's mountain.
Yeah.
Um, and it's the sort of circumstance where you wouldn't be all that startled to see a Sasquatch just lurching out of the darkness.
Yeah.
It was that mythic.
Yeah. And
Um,
also nature going, okay, this is the kind of thing that you have to approach slowly,
yes,
attentively, right? And
yeah,
so the mist is there to slow you down, to heighten your senses, and
and boy did it. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
so that's even though we were there a day early, that definitely, yeah, it was harrowing at the time.
Hmm.
Um, but it definitely adds a certain piquant flavor to the remainder of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. What what I was thinking, yeah, like I think, the standard move in this place, this day and age would be like, okay, you're onto something. Now turn it into a teachable system that you can monetize and promote and all of that, right? You become like the leader of this movement, of this new thing. Um, and there's a market for it because we know there's a meaning crisis and there's a lot of people who fall into the spiritual but not religious category and all of that. Like, so there's a market that we've identified, there's a need, and you've got something and you've got an accent, you're just old enough, you've got the white hair, you could probably pass as a guru type, you know? Uh, but what I like and what I'm hearing is that you're not doing that and you're kind of like actively refusing that. Um, but what I think like what I'm sensing is what could actually be helpful is a kind of like if we're thinking like the bricoleur, is like what are the building blocks of a poetic faith that actually does the job of connecting us to something greater, to awakening our sense of meaning and our creativity and our intuition and imagination. um, I was thinking about the building blocks, and that might be like the best thing to offer actually, is like allow people to fill in the blanks, but give them a starting point for like what to start like looking for, right? Does that seem useful to you? It's kind of where my
Yeah, well,
mind goes. Yeah.
yeah, that's very much the motivation behind creating the Poetic Faiths anthology.
Hmm.
Is that look, I have a copy here. This is actually a proof copy, so the cover design is a little different.
Yep.
And this is not a commercial money grab because maybe five people in the world will see this and say, "Oh, that's a good idea," and two of them will actually buy it. But these are the practices that we deal with in volume one. There are volumes two and three already basically laid out. There's potential for volume four and five and so on as well. I could keep going. I'm not proud or tired. Um, the idea is that by presenting a reading audience, albeit a very, very small reading audience, with this series of very practical examples, interviews with people who have taken this extraordinary, rare, bizarre, crazy step of saying, you know what, I am going to create my own poetic faith, my own embodied philosophy, my own ritualized philosophical practice. I'm going to name it. I'm going to create the aesthetic. I'm going to develop the art. I'm going to enact the ritual. It's all I'm going to do this stuff. I think it will at least offer people a sense of permission to approach the idea as a kind of thought experiment. And I think that, just doing it as a thought experiment is probably apt to be very valuable for a much larger number of people than would ever take the extraordinary step of enacting the thing in the real world. Um, in terms of how to, I can only really speak from my own experience, and I did that earlier when
Hmm.
I was talking about finding the touchstones, finding the grand theme, the grand narrative, and feeling empowered, having given myself permission to take that step. So I could tell people how to do it from my point of view. All of the interviewees in the book, the first question was like, what is your motivation for doing this? And most of them, effectively, during the course of the 6 or 7 standard interview questions, answered that question from their own radically different points of view. So that's volume one. Volumes two and three, there'll be another probably 10, maybe 15, eventually 20 similar stories. So someone who sat down in 50 years' time and read all 4 or 5 or however many volumes end up being produced, they'll have a really good sense of they'll at least have a great sense of what has been done before in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be able to trace methodology out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's the way my mind works. Always trying to look, it's probably why like I'm an archetypally oriented therapist. because I'm always interested in like the underlying pattern and like trying to go as far as I can go to finding that pattern. And so, yeah, a nice kind of like overview of different poetic faiths. But then I'm like picking out like, well, what are the common elements here that make up these poetic faiths that are actually working for people, right? And so like one of the things I've thought of over the years that would be in there is like the little rituals, the little meaningful rituals, something like what I call an archetypal altar. So some kind of altar or
Okay.
shrine that holds these images and objects that are meaningful to you. The entering in, well, resonant images like the skull. For me, the Sacred Heart is a big one. So collecting these resonant images together, maybe they're on the altar or around the altar or on you or tattoo or jewelry. Something about entering into an altered state, which could be going into nature or doing some kind of breath practice or meditative practice, something like that. Embodied physical practice is something that I see as a commonality and something that's been really important part of my practice. You know, taking the building blocks of yoga that I studied for many years and coming up with something I call Brai Chi. Like it's my own breath and movement practice that doesn't look anything like what people think of as yoga for the most part. Um, Something about using the voice, invocation, evocation,
Yes.
incantation, verbal charm. That to me, I've seen is like really important and consistent through all religious ritual, spiritual practice. Um, Repetition being like just that enactment, whether that's monthly cycles, seasonal cycles, yearly cycles, daily cycles. Um, how am I doing in terms of like,
Well, I mean, as you've been listing those, I've been ticking them all off in terms of my own practice of the Mysterium and going, yep, 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 yep. Yes, absolutely. Um, it's a little difficult for me because I'm sort of answering from the point of view of the Mysterium, which we've been talking about a bit here, which is my own very idiosyncratic personal poetic faith. But also as the editor of the book, I'm conscious of sort of wanting to represent a number of other practices as well. And I'm bearing in mind that there are five listed here. The next book, there'll be at least another five. The book after that, there's at least another five. So in terms of universals, um, I couldn't say right now. I'd have to go. I'd have to basically review a bunch of interviews that we did several years ago now, and then try and trace them and say, okay, yes, yes, they have a version of that, and they have a version of this. I think that the list you gave is excellent. It certainly describes much of my practice to a T. I suspect that it does for many of the other people who are interview subjects. I know that it wouldn't for all of them. Some of them take the idea in a very different kind of direction. For some of them, it's much less about the sort of personal practice that I think you and I are involved in, and it's literally more about creating something that could change the world.
hmm,
Or there's one that is a practice that um, effectively leads up towards a literally citywide event that takes place on one night of the year, and then all of the rest of their activity is sort of
mhm,
leading up
mhm.
to that, and then they begin that again the next year. So there are radically different perspectives as well. But for the type of poetic faith that you and I have been mostly talking about here, I'd say that was a superb list.
You know, uh, okay, this makes sense because there are like different categories of ceremony, ritual, practice, and maybe those are categories in a way. There's like personal practice, there's the communal ritual, and there's the more established ceremony or something like that. Like, so even like looking at different categories or subdivisions of poetic faith, something like that. Because like, yeah, for me, it's always been like martial arts, yoga, music, you know, those all start with the very personal practice, you know, and then maybe at like a concentric circle out from that is some kind of communal practice, but everything I've done in the personal practice, I bring into those communal practices. It informs it. It allows me to perform a certain role in those contexts, with more people involved. Um, there's something there too. Like I'm like the guy who's like interested in writing the Poetic Faith manual without being like super prescriptive about what exactly you should be do, but like here are some guiding principles. Here's a kind of
Yeah.
general attitude to take, and then the rest is up for you to fill in the blanks.
Now, we haven't talked about M. Dudek, but I'm expecting M's Poetic Faith, which is called The Religion Virus, to feature in the next volume of the anthology. And M goes alternately by he and they. I'll refer to them as they for this purpose. M is an artist, Canadian, in fact, countryman of yours, I think, originally. Lives and works in Italy, travels all over the world creating. I can't remember if we discussed M in the last interview.
I think you mentioned, or maybe offline, you said, "Hey, check out M's work." Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, um, M is a professional academic and also a professional artist. And their work is all connected with this thing called the religion virus, which is basically a queer science fiction religion. And so they will recently, M was in Korea, or sometime last year. M was also inclined to go off on sabbatical and just drop out of any sort of communication for months and months on end. But it's always nice to hear from them. But they were in Korea creating installations and art galleries of these fantastically sort of elaborate alien temples. And the alien temples represent aspects of the religion virus, which is M's science fiction religion. And they have created a language for it and like a script, a written script, and individual artworks and performance art pieces, all revolving around the idea of the religion virus, which is this massive sort of science fiction epic of what religion is, set in a far future world. I'm trying my best to do it justice, but I know I'm going to fail. Set in a kind of a far distant future where religion is basically everything. I can't possibly do it justice. If you're interested, to anyone who's watching, just look it up. But part of M's academic interest is in what I refer to as poetic faith or cult punk, which we were talking about in the last podcast. And M is currently writing, which is probably the book that you're looking for, which is an elaboration of their academic thesis. The title then was something like "How to Create a Religion" or how to invent a religion. And I don't think I'm speaking out of school, but I know that is a work in progress. And I am certainly waiting with bated breath for that book to come out, because I think that will be the practical manual that probably you and I and a select number of other weirdos are looking for.
Hmm. Didn't Tim Leary write a book called How to Invent
Yes.
Your Own Religion? Something like that?
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. And Tim Leary was M's direct predecessor, basically.
mm, mm.
Yeah, Leary was one of a number of people in the 60s and 70s who created his own psychedelic religion. And this was inspired at the time. I think the Native American Church had just recently received a sort of legal dispensation to use, would it be mescaline or
Oh, peyote.
anyway, peyote, yeah,
Mm,
a traditional plant medicine in their ritual. And at the time, war on drugs and so forth, this was before the war on drugs, but peyote was technically illegal, I believe. They received a special dispensation to use it because their ancestors had been using it for thousands of years, and it was granted. So the law, the government said, yes, it's okay for you people to use this substance in this context. In the spirit of the gambler's throw, I would suggest a whole lot of hippies then said, well, we've created our own religions as well,
yeah.
using LSD or psilocybin or whatever as our sacrament. And Leary wrote a book on the subject, which is, I always get his title confused with M's. One of them is how to start a religion, how to create a religion, something like that. which is really fun reading. I quote a bit of it in the introduction to the
Mm.
book, but yeah, the whole thing, it's very 60s, that
Yeah.
thing, but in quite a fun, positive way.
Well, and it's like it's more about dropping out, and I think today what we need is for people to really step up
Yeah.
because society's going to hell, the environment's, in crisis and all of that. And so I think if your poetic faith, if your religion isn't addressing some of these larger issues, then it's what would you say, solipsistic, navel gazing, self-serving.
One of the profound differences between the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s and the counterculture that I foresee emerging within the next, I don't know, 25 years or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, man, it's really fun talking with you. I feel like, we're soul brothers in the poetic faith, and I love that like um we don't have to like have the same practice. We don't have to think about it the same way. There's respect for my idiosyncratic poetic faith, and I have respect for yours and what it means to you. And there's something in that like we're keep talking about what's underlying everything, what's the kind of invisible connective tissue. And I think like it's not just tolerance, but it's more respect and value of someone else's faith or their spiritual practice. And that's like where we can actually come together in diversity.
Yeah. Yeah. I asked a number of the interviewees, those who seem to be most into the idea of poetic faiths, because some of them understandably are really very, very much focused on their own thing. And others were at least interested in the idea that there were other people doing this sort of thing, and so on. So I tended to ask those people to hypothetically imagine a point at some point in the future, maybe decades into the future, where there's enough of this stuff going on that it's created its own countercultural scene.
Hmm.
And I think that's probably the ideal. I don't think it's ever apt to become institutionalized. I think there's something
God, no.
inherent to the idea of it being anti-authoritarian, naturalistic, and
Yes,
creative,
please.
and those things are anathema to institutionalization. I think
Yeah.
institutions, come to think of it, institutions are good at infrastructure.
Hmm.
That's it. That's the thing that institutions can do. I've often used the analogy of the street festival. A number of years ago, my wife and I were on an anniversary vacation to Asheville, North Carolina. Very countercultural little sort of neo-hippie enclave in the North Carolina mountains. And there was a street festival going on, probably the single best street festival I've ever been to, and I'm a bit of a connoisseur of those things.
Mm.
I remember at one point actually turning to Kat, to my wife, and saying, you know what? I don't believe in gods or ghosts or magic, but I take them really seriously. And that was the sort of insight that this particular street festival conjured. Um, there was a sense that there's a sense of festival, which a lot of the people who are involved in the poetic faiths are creating their own festival. Um, Two of them actually get really into that. They talk about festive culture a great deal in their interview. And it's something that does happen in the world, but just not very often, or it's kind of glossed over as being like a joke or a parody. And people don't tend to look below the surface. But below the surface, there's genuine meaning in a lot of this stuff. It's just I think it's so far outside of the box, so far outside of the institutional mindset that it's invisible to most people. And I think in the sort of Hakim Bey temporary autonomous zone sense, that's probably a really good thing.
Mm. Hmm.
But street festivals. So this particular street festival um, was set up, I think, by local artists, and it had that vibe. And I've been to other street festivals around Chicago that were set up by corporations, by commercial outfits that have been brought in by the local what are they called?
Chamber of Commerce or
Chamber
something.
of Commerce, exactly.
Yeah.
And the local Chamber of Commerce has thought we should have a street festival because it will attract interest and we will make more money.
Yeah, bring
So
business
they
to the
pay,
downtown area.
yeah.
Yes.
So they pay a company to come in, and the company comes in with a bouncy castle and um, a tame face painter, and that's the street festival. And of course, it's absolutely soulless because it's been set up by people who are good at infrastructure, but know jack shit about soul.
Mhm.
Now, the flip side of that is you don't necessarily want artists in charge of your infrastructure.
Yeah, it'd be chaos. Yeah.
Yes. The problem, I think, is that especially today, far too many people, especially far too many young people, default to the institution. They expect the institution to take care of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that one of the advantages, one of the strengths of the 60s and 70s counterculture, those kids were not protesting in order to be protected from ideas they didn't like. And I worry that mindset is too strong, young people today.
Right.
You can't do this stuff on an institutional basis. Institution is anathema to poetic faith, and I think vice versa.
Hmm.
But potentially, it can be a scene. It
Yeah.
can be something that is word of mouth. It can be something where I'm anticipating eventually, for example, there'll be a documentary produced on this phenomenon that we're talking about. I may well have a hand in doing that. I think that there should be art exhibits where people like yourself and M. Dudek and myself and a bunch of other people contribute their art, whatever it is, their art that represents their poetic faith. And members of the public can go and learn a bit and experience something of this phenomenon as a wider field and come
Hmm.
away with some understanding of all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that there should be, and eventually will be, academic attention as well. I know a number of academics are interested in reviewing the book. And I think that is how the sort of cultural movement that will create the scene that we're talking about, I think that's eventually how that will happen.
Yeah.
I hope it will happen within my lifetime. I'm not entirely confident of that.
Hey, we're gonna make it happen because I want to go to that festival. I want to go to that party where we all come
Yeah,
together as
yeah.
eclectic practitioners and swap stories, show a little bit of what we're doing. Um, that would be amazing. A festival. And I love that you use this word because that to me speaks to something that's eclectic. Like James Hillman never wanted an institution made in his name, didn't want a school founded in his name and his ideas. The only thing that he would allow was a festival, which is a coming together of all the eclectic thinkers who are in this broad category of post-Jungian psychology or archetypal psychology, where they would share ideas and new things would germinate out of that mixture. And that's what I'm interested in.
I didn't know
I,
that
I don't
about
want to go
Hillman,
to
but
a
that's
lecture.
fascinating.
I don't want to go to a lecture of you telling me here's what I've been doing and like something about the building blocks, the framework, the things that are anathema. Like I think like Poetic Faith deserves no more than a pamphlet because any more than that gets too didactic, too prescriptive, too theoretical. But something like a mini manual or something.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what I had a go at doing with the Cult Punk Manifesto, which we talked
Yeah.
about last time. M's book, I'm sure, is it'll combine both of those things, but he's basically a genius. Yeah, kind of genius, and I think that their book will be both of those things in the best sense. There'll be enough theory, and it'll be interesting theory and interesting history and so on. And then, as what I would consider to be a senior practitioner of this stuff, there'll be enough of the guidance, the building blocks that people will be able to take that as the instruction manual that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And certainly that book will go alongside the volumes of the Poetic Faith. I literally have the beginnings of a Poetic Faith bookshelf right over there, which is the books that have been written already in this still really very new nascent field.
Yeah.
But yes, yeah, it'll be festival, it'll be gathering of the tribes, I hope. Um, at least before it becomes a matter of sort of academic conference.
Oh, please. Yes.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
not
They can do
dry
that.
it
They
out
can
and
do the
dissect
academic.
it.
Yeah, they can do the academic conference about the festival if they want to.
Yeah.
But the
Right.
festival is actually the important thing.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's great. And I'm just like happy to be involved in any peripheral way. But I've got a background in design and magazine work. I'm really good at distilling things down and making them graphic and punchy. So I'm the guy. I'm going to make the chapbook or the pamphlet. I'm going to collect what you guys have been doing and maybe add my own little checklist. But it's something I want to collaborate on. I think that'd be really fun.
It would be fun. It occurred to me some time ago, probably a zine format would actually be good for this stuff.
That's what I mean. Yeah, just something
Yeah,
that you can print out on your laser printer and fold and staple it yourself, maybe, and
yeah.
color, you know?
Old school 90s zine. It would be very, very appropriate to a lot of this. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I started. So, yeah. All right, we'll talk about it. And I'm looking forward to the next series too, and who you've gotten that. I know you talked about one of my favorite characters on the scene, Alan Moore.
Yes.
You talked to him. I'm really interested to see what he had to say about it. Yeah, it's going to be really great to follow along. Yeah, any idea when volume two is due?
Well, the original plan was to do them fairly intensively over the course of about this next year.
Okay.
We're about 1 month out from volume one here. I'm already, I mean, I already have a pretty good sense of structure in terms of how volume two will be laid out. And really, a lot of the work that's gone into this one saves us time on the next
Yeah,
several
yeah.
volumes because we've already made choices about just the nuts and bolts stuff, the
Yeah.
layout and the font and all of that. Um, so I would imagine within the next several months, probably before July or during July, volume two will be coming out. Volume three should be out before the end of the year at least. And then as I'm going, I'm also like just recently I did an online event called Limicon, which was a sort of a month-long gathering of people who were involved, especially in meta-modern forms of spirituality. And I got, I think, 3 really good contacts from there. And I pay pretty serious attention to this stuff. But there were 3 practitioners there who were presenting things that really should be in future volumes of the Poetic Faith book. And I just had no idea because they just hadn't come across my radar before.
Hmm.
So there is the potential for the Poetic Faiths anthology to just keep on going. I'm quite keen that things like the documentary that might be developed out of it should happen in the nearer future,
Hmm.
maybe within the next year, the next couple of years. I know how big a project that is. I've co-produced and co-directed a couple
Yeah.
of little indie documentaries over the years. It's a big project and a big ask, but
Hmm.
I think that would be sort of the logical next step.
Yep. And I think we should have the first Poetic Faith festival in Canada because the way things are going, I mean, our dollar is about half the American dollar, so it's a lot cheaper to get venues, to travel, for accommodation up here in Canada, and it'd be a lot easier for me to go to. So let's see if we can make it happen.
And I don't know. This is the thing though, Brian? I mean, it's a lovely dream, but it's also to some extent a numbers game. I mean, I think that we could organize an event where it's like you, me, Brendan Graham Dempsey, M. Dudek, um, Jenkinson, probably not,
He wouldn't
honestly.
be involved, I'll tell you right now.
Yeah. Um, but maybe Deborah Kelly from Australia, who's the mastermind behind the creation, which is listed here.
Hmm.
Colin Campbell, who created Aretéanism. Sean Manso. I'm just listing off the people who were interviewed in the first volume. Sean Manso's, which is the first church of David Bowie Phonomancer. We could probably do something that gathered all of us together in the same space one way or the other. I mean, virtually would be certainly easiest and probably at
Not
least
as much
fun.
fun. Not as much
It
fun.
would be fun, but not as much fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the whole concept is so avant-garde. I mean, I tell the story. My wife was, when we just started on the book project, I was just starting to do the interviews. My wife was discussing it with one of her colleagues, who's apparently a very nice lady, very sort of Orthodox Christian type lady. And my wife casually dropped a phrase. It was something like non-theistic religion. And this lady's jaw just, anyway, non-theistic religion. And, perfectly smart lady, but it takes time.
Mm.
I'm gathering some experience at trying to explain this idea quickly. And it's not easily done. So the thing that concerns me is that it doesn't concern me, but I'm aware of it. Is just the sheer sort of statistical unlikelihood of gathering of enough people who understand this and the potentials of it to be able to gather in one place at one time to create a festival. Those of us who are already kind of neck deep in the thing, we could get together. We'd have a great time. Yeah, we could do that at Sky Meadow or wherever. Gathering a community, I don't know if I'm apt to live to see that.
We'll see. I think, man, I thought I was the most pessimistic guy in the room usually, but I'm very optimistic here. Um, Maybe it's
Yeah,
just
I
because
don't
I
know if
want it
that's
so bad.
pessimism. I mean, I want it too. But
Mm.
I've also been dealing with the numbers for a long time, and I've seen the look in people's eyes. Lay people, interested, intelligent people, when I start talking about this, and
Yeah,
the barrier is it's just so far off the beaten track.
dude.
It's so far out of left field.
Okay, I think I'm figuring out why.
Yeah.
You're in the Midwest, in USA, Midwest. I'm on the West Coast of Canada on an island. I mean, I'm like, now people around here would love it. Like they kind of are
Yes.
trying to create this thing on their own without any kind of conceptual framework and just fumbling around in the dark, as like magpies. So something like this would speak to a lot of people up in this area for sure.
Yeah. I know what you mean, and I have had the experience of going to places like Sky Meadow when I go back to New Zealand. Certainly, there is a potential audience. Whether that potential audience is in fact large enough to be able to and organized enough to be able to like
Well,
get itself
we can
together.
bunk up together. We'll do it on the cheap. We just
Yes,
need the
just
venue. That's all.
first several, I suspect at least.
All
But yeah,
right. Cheers.
I would be all about doing that if it could happen. I would be there with bells on, as we used to say.
Yeah, right on. Well, it's been great, man, and we'll keep talking. I'm sure this conversation will keep rolling as things develop.
Yeah.